man was walking in the woods one day when he saw a bear out of the corner of his eye. He stopped, said a silent prayer. God, I know you can do all things. Will you please make this bear a fellow Christian? The bear caught up to the man, placed his paw on the man's shoulder, and said, Brother, will you pray with me? Dear God, for this meal that I am about to receive, make me truly thankful. This is The Christian Bear with Dr. Ben Hilskamp. Welcome to episode 43 of The Christian Bear. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Hilskamp. Today it's my pleasure to welcome the Reverend Will Dickinson to the podcast. A graduate of the University of Virginia and Yale Divinity School, Will serves as Associate Rector at St. George Church in Fredericksburg, Virginia. He is a musician, artist, and theologian who writes on the intersection of faith, identity, art, sexuality, and reconciliation. Join me in welcoming Will to The Christian Bear. Will, thank you again for joining us today on this episode of The Christian Bear. I'm very excited to have your perspective and your wisdom as we look at the things we believe and how we talk about belief. So I've been sarcastically calling this the quote-unquote easy question. What do you believe?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, it's such a funny aspect of being a priest that somehow before being ordained and being after being ordained, someone decides that you have something interesting to say. So it's lovely. I mean, it's a lovely way to go through life. Like I believe in a lot of things, but I think at the core of it comes down to a few for me. One, that being a human is really hard. I'm not sure if it was always intended to be that way, but that is the way that it's ended up, and that we need help. And two, for me, the idea that help comes in the form of a creator, a lover, someone, something, some being that I call God, who gives me both direction to go and also the strength to travel in that direction. The different ways that it is hard to be in a human vary from person to person, but I think some of the advice and the guidance is pretty universal. And a couple of those other core beliefs for me are that generally I expect very little of human beings and expect a lot of God. And you know that word God can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but some kind of force, some kind of wisdom that makes up for the messiness of humans. And I think that if we're able to do that, to believe strongly in some kind of possibility that is beyond us, but also temper our expectations of those around us, then we get to walk through life with joy and surprise at every turn. I mean, quite frankly, this is the last core belief, right? The idea that anything goes well gets to be a gracious and joyous surprise, and that's just at the core of how I walk through life and how I care for people. And that's where I'll stop, because otherwise, you let a preacher start talking and they'll never stop.
He's the third preacher, Episcopal priest, who has said those very same words before stopping a comment.
I think it probably speaks to a self-consciousness in our tradition about our preaching, and how it tends to not be as long as other Protestant traditions. So we try and overemphasize.
Or perhaps emphasizes the attention span of our tradition.
Could be that.
Among those of us in the laity. Thank you very much for for answering that question so well. How have you come to hold the beliefs that you hold?
Yeah, yeah. I think foremost for me, out of necessity. I mean, it really just comes back to this core principle of life is hard. um, and and for me, the beliefs that have stuck are not always the ones with which I was raised. I mean, I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and I am an Episcopal priest now, but I grew up in a Christian context where Jesus didn't really follow us home. It was sort of a thing that we left at church, and through my life, through many seasons of confusion and doubt and despair and otherwise, just the normal process of being a human. Um, I have needed something powerful to sustain me. I have needed to believe in not just a God in concept, but a God in reality, who has the kind of will to love and the power to love beyond me, beyond my own limits. And so I think that probably points to a little bit of trial and error. I've bounced around from tradition to tradition. I spent some time, definitely would not have called myself a Christian in my teenage years. Um, and it's just sort of been like seeing what works and seeing what sustains me. And I remember in particular, I mean, probably the reason why I believe the core principles that I do, was I came out as queer in my teenage years, to a few people at a time, and then publicly after I graduated high school, and I like knew that the Episcopal Church was sort of down with queer folks. Maybe not. I didn't quite know how that worked out, but I didn't know that God didn't just like not care that I was gay, but like loved that I am. Um, and that I think is the moment where like belief started to really crack open in my life. That it wasn't just a series of principles or ethical beliefs. It was this kind of visceral. I actually need this to survive. I need this to feel loved. And that has just been a matter of being in conversation with people, you know, pouring through texts and thinking together about ideas and seeing what sticks and being in conversation. And somehow, I'm sure that process is not even close to ending, but I've arrived at a space that feels sustaining to me.
Excellent, thank you. I wonder if you could elaborate some more on. There were 2 points in there that I'd like to ask about. First one is I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this notion of church sort of stayed at church
Yeah.
and didn't go home. The reason I ask is I would wager a guess that about half of our audience are folks who are coming from Roman Catholic, Episcopalian, ELCA, Lutheran type backgrounds, and the other half are probably coming from fundamentalist and evangelical backgrounds. And while I definitely resonate, having grown up Roman Catholic, having become Episcopalian as an adult, that idea that church kind of stays at church and doesn't come home rings a lot of bells. I imagine for some of our evangelical fundamentalist listeners or those who grew up with that tradition, that might not sound like, whether or not it is a good thing at all, might really sound, I don't know, might just not sound like how Christians are raised.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on that and how that played out for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think what what a helpful question. I think that in some ways, I mean, that critique of like, oh, that doesn't actually sound like how Christianity or Christians are supposed to work. I think that critique rings true to me, in a way. I mean, certainly to me specifically. Um, I think that in my experience, and I know that this is not everyone's, um, that the shape of my faith growing up um, was not really to expect that much of God. And so when I say we sort of left Jesus or left God at church, it was this combination of, well, we don't want to ask too much of God. And so we're not going to ask God to come into the other areas of our life. And behind that, I think, was this real fear that even if we asked, that God wouldn't do it, or that God would be, otherwise engaged or occupied. Um, and I think that fear is a little bit more present in the more progressive spectrum of the Christian tradition than we always realize. And I think for me, I really needed to go on a journey of discovering my deep need in life, and my deep desire to be known and to experience a radical kind of saving love, in order for me to learn that I could ask a lot of God. In fact, I could ask everything. Um, and I think, there's also an aspect to that, that's beyond the spiritual, that gets into the material. Um, if you look at a demographic cross section of Episcopalians in particular, right? Like it's the Christian denomination that has the highest percentage of advanced degrees, highest percentage of terminal degrees, right up there with highest household income. And so when I say that we didn't necessarily ask God for help a lot, well, it's because a lot of our material needs were covered. And I'm aware that for most Christians, that is simply not the case, right? That God, we actually can't afford to think of God as this purely ethereal or conceptual thing, but God needs to be acting in the material and acting on our behalf, and does. And I think both through my life and especially now in my ministry, I have seen the ways that God acts materially on behalf of God's people, which is everyone, by the way. And that has continued to really shape my faith. I hope that's an answer to your question.
It definitely is. It went somewhere else than I thought you would go, but no, it is. That's a very good answer. Thank you. The other thing that you had said earlier that I wanted to ask about is, at least in my work, and um, I'm pretty sure you know at least some of what I do, but working with an organization that promotes LGBTQIA plus inclusion in the church and
Yeah.
affirmation in the church. We often look at, kind of, I don't want to make this too formal, but like the stages that different churches and congregations and denominations go through when talking about queer people in well, frankly, in their
Yeah.
midst. Um, we talk about, hate and exclusion. We talk about tolerance. We talk about affirmation, and then everyone seems to ask, after affirmation, what comes next?
Hmm.
And what I always tell them is, after affirmation comes celebration.
Hmm.
And you started to go there, and I wonder if you would elaborate a little bit further for you and in your life, where that change and how that change shows up between like sort of affirmation and we're including you here to we are actually celebrating you as a queer person.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it makes me think of. I tell this story all the time. It was such a short moment, but it lives so deeply in my memory. I When I was an undergrad at UVA, the University of Virginia, and was sort of in the midst of figuring out what tradition really spoke to me, and was probably having like a Buddhist Episcopalian moment at that time. I don't know, who knows. But I spent a lot of time at the Center for Christian Study, which is an organization that gives a home to a lot of evangelical fellowships at UVA, and now there are other study centers at other universities. But it meant that I wasn't a part of any of the fellowships, and so I didn't have to really navigate um, what it meant to be an out queer person in those contexts, which were not officially affirming. And so I got to be in this sort of liminal space where I was in this physical building where like a lot of these folks hung out with. And I was, friends with a ton of them. And it was this beautiful just confluence of thoughts and ideas. And I remember one time I had just become friends with this guy named Bradford, and I don't even know how we started talking, but like maybe a few weeks, maybe a month into our friendship, he sort of finally like turned to me and asked, like, so what is it like to choose like yourself and like your sexuality over the Bible? And I think there's a version of myself that would have heard that as an attack. It would have said, well, that like, how dare you frame it that way? And I'm grateful that in that moment I was able to like just assume best intentions, and like I heard where he was going. It was a genuine question, and I got to just like testify to the beauty of how God moves through my identity and my relationship with other queer people, and share how for me the fact that there are so many children up for adoption, for example, that and so many queer couples willing to adopt, or queer families willing to adopt, um, and like that connection really stuck in his mind and sort of unlocked something. um, and like sharing my desire for relationship and family, for Bradford was able to connect with his desire for relationship and family, and like that was a moment where for him it shifted um, from wonder, like, or curiosity, to affirmation. And then as we built this relationship further on, he got to celebrate with me. He got to be excited when I started dating a man, and like got to just just be part of life in the same way that I would for him. And that moment, like that sort of precipice, I think, is one that feels really scary in churches a lot of the time, because it's easy to say, well, all are welcome here, like you can come in, um, even if you're queer, even if you're trans, even if you're ace or whatever. um, it's harder to say we are actually going to learn how to celebrate you in our midst. And we're going to do the work of transforming our community into one that has not just a hypothetical place for you, but like a place that is shaped like you. Um, yeah, I mean, that is beautiful work when it is done well. But man, it is hard and intimidating to do.
So, has any experience made you question your beliefs? Did your beliefs change, and if so, how?
Yeah, yeah. I know. I thought a lot about this question. I think I, like many ordained folks, as part of my formation, did a stint of hospital chaplaincy, and it is a testament to how well we have, or how good we've become at hiding away some of the hard aspects of being a human. Um, it's a testament to that, how shocking and surprised I was at some of the kinds of things that happen in the quiet and sanitized hospital room. All of which is to say, when you're a chaplain, like, you get called into the hard stuff. And some of which, it was the first time in my life where I felt like I was shielding my friends and family from some knowledge that is really just difficult to hold. um, and I think some of the real tragedies that I encountered there, um, and the loneliness that happens to the very ill, and the indignity that comes with being very ill and without choices often, whether it's in the midst or the end of life. And I'm being purposefully vague here, but that experience in general really, I mean, really challenged a, a kind of innate belief in God's care and goodness, you know, and anyone, like anyone who is human long enough, experiences those same kinds of challenges, right? Um, it's it's so hard to sustain a belief in God's care and goodness when we're in the midst of a valley. Um, One thing that helped um, was being part of a tradition, the Christian tradition that again wasn't just a series of conceptual thoughts or beliefs, but a tradition where belief was practiced and manifested, and embodied. And I think for me, it's such a gift to be part of a sacramental tradition where I going to church isn't just speaking and listening. It's also, um, touching my forehead with holy water on the way into the church. It's also kneeling to pray. It's holding my hands out in expectation for the bread and the wine in communion. And all of those things, all of those embodied actions carried my anxiety, my concern, my fear, without me having to come up with the words. And I realized that, like, just letting my body do these things that were familiar to it was a way of sustaining belief when my conceptual brain couldn't. Um, and when my brain caught up, right, when I had done sufficient reflection, and talked with enough people and been uplifted by enough folks who had been in just as difficult circumstances or worse, when my brain caught up, then there was my body to meet it joyfully. Um, so I guess the answer to your question is, like, my belief in God's goodness didn't change, but it was nuanced, right? Like the way that I choose to believe was nuanced, which I think, not to extend my monologue here, um, but I think that's such an important piece of this conversation is how we choose to manifest our beliefs. Speaking again, like as a queer person, like I wish that the Christian community, particularly in the States, could manifest its belief in God's love for all in ways that might challenge it more. And might make more space for queer folks. But oftentimes, the shape of that belief, the embodiment of that belief, is a kind of close offedness. That, well, here is our statement, and that's our statement, and this is our statement, and that's the beginning and end. And it doesn't get shaped through practice, or embodiment or challenge or relationship or community with other people, because that could challenge it.
Thank you. I really resonate with what you said about the sacramental nature of that, and almost, for this isn't what you said, but for lack of a better word, almost the muscle memory of some of the physical gestures that sacramental
Oh, I love
traditions
that.
make.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience to that quite recently, where my brain
Yeah.
was frustrated and not in a prayerful headspace, but there was something peaceful to making the sign of the cross, to bowing my head at a certain part of a prayer because that's just what we do. So that definitely that speaks to me.
There's a there's this great line about hymn singing that, um, we don't always sing hymns because we believe what the hymn says. We sing hymns because we want to believe what the hymn says. And I think about that all the time. I'm a musician, and there's a muscle memory to that too. To feeling in our bodies what we hope is true, and trying to manifest that belief in the world for others.
Totally. So if you had to boil your beliefs down into one, maybe two core fundamental beliefs, what would that belief or those beliefs be?
Yeah.
This is also one of those easy questions.
Yeah, very straightforward. I think we were made to love and to be loved, and we haven't quite gotten the hang of it yet. And God is going to stick with us until we do.
Amen. So, Will, as I said before we started recording, um, I'd love to leave time at the end for my guests to add anything that we didn't talk about, or platform or promote anything that they're working on or that they have coming up. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wish that I was an important enough person to have things to promote. I hope one day I might be. Um, I would simply point people to a couple of things that I've been reading recently that probably have informed this conversation. Which LOL is not the Bible, but people should probably read that. But no. But this, I've been really formed by the work of Mockingbird Ministries, which is a kind of publication and like kind of a corner of the Episcopal Church, but kind of beyond it. And Dave Zoll, who is the editor of Mockingbird, has a new book out called Low Anthropology, which is all about that kind of low expectations of humans, high expectations of God, and the way that can open us up to just see the world as miraculous and wondrous. And that it felt like that book gave words to a feeling that I had felt for a long time. And so I'm very grateful for his work in it. And then I think partially because queerness came up in this conversation, as it often does with me, I would point people to an essay, and please keep listening, even if you're not essay minded, by Rowan Williams, called The Body's Grace, which he delivered to a gay and lesbian organization in Britain in 1989. And you will read this essay and you will say, how in the world did this happen in 1989? But that essay really opened my eyes to seeing the particular gift that queer people can be in the church and to the church. And in particular, teaching about what it means to be folks who, because of the world around us, have to develop an even more specific and nuanced vocabulary to describe who we are and whose we are. And it's such a liberating little essay.
Thank you so much. Well, that's the end of my questions. So I just want to say again, thank you so much for being on the Christian Bear today. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's such a privilege to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Ben.
This has been the Christian Bear with Dr. Ben Hilskamp.